Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog on Mint Press, where we watch the watchers. As you know, weekly we are uncovering new stories with serious investigative journalism, and we ask that you support us in what we do by clicking like, subscribe, by commenting, by sharing this video, and of course supporting us on Patreon and other places that you may be able to support the very important public service that I feel Mint Press provides. Now, this week we have three interesting guests, a real triple threat to investigate Israel's role in Hollywood. This is not something that many publishing outlets look clearly at and then understand the effect that that can have on the forming of culture. But to start with, I do think it's important we mention the sabotaging of the Nord Stream pipelines. This is an action which no doubt will lead to many people in Germany this winter having a very hard time indeed. Of course, Joe Biden earlier this year had said that if Russia were to take action in Ukraine, there would no longer be a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And he assured the journalists asking him about it that we being the United States, bring an end to it. Now, what we've seen is NATO just yesterday blaming the attack on Nord Stream pipelines on, quote unquote, some unknown actor. They didn't identify who that actor was, but they did threaten a military response against that unknown actor. In the aftermath of the explosions on both of the Nord Stream pipelines, we saw a Polish MEP and former foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, imply very heavily that the United States was responsible when he wrote a tweet saying, "Thank you to the United States." Something that has caused even more raised eyebrows by many has been that Radek Sikorski actually then deleted the tweet around a day later. What I believe is that this should lead to a greater criticality, especially in this country, about the role Britain has had in arming Ukraine. Some of our friends at Declassified UK have recently published a very good overview of Britain's role in this conflict. But something that has largely gone unnoticed is that just last month, it was published in Defense Post and other places that Britain had provided Ukraine with underwater drones. The use of those drones was something that the British Diving and Threat Exploitation Group and the US Navy 6th Fleet trained Ukrainian forces in how to use. Those drones can go around 100 meters under sea level. And of course, we do know that the Nord Stream pipelines go around 100 meters under sea level. So there are some question marks there. And all of this, unfortunately, has ratcheted up the threat of nuclear war, something that all of us must do everything we can to avoid. And someone who has done more than anyone to oppose US wars over the last 2 to 3 decades has, of course, been Julian Assange, who currently sits in Belmarsh prison. This is someone that I believe to be a hero of the global anti-war movement, the physical manifestation of that thrust behind the 30 million plus people who are believed to have mobilized against the Iraq war in February and March 2003. Now, on the 8th of October, myself, along with many others, we will be outside the British Houses of Parliament, joining hands and surrounding the Parliament to demand the release of Julian Assange and the British government finally take a stand and do not extradite this man to the United States, where it has been put forth that he is actually likely not to survive the US prison system. All of us have a debt to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as investigators, as journalists, as those that care about the spreading of information in the public interest. We have a duty towards Julian Assange. So I hope that all of us tuning in, can do everything we can to be there outside the British Houses of Parliament on the 8th of October and bring a friend. Now, to get into today's topic, it's important that we have a look at the development of the Israel lobby within Hollywood. Of course, the ADL is one of the United States' key Israel lobby groups. It's an organization that even the FBI in 1968, the year when the FBI began working with them, put in an internal memo that they found it incredible to assume that the ADL was not furnished to an official of the Israeli government. Now, of course, documents were released that found that a lot of the ADL's initial funding came from key figures within Hollywood, and even Warner Brothers Studios actually contributed heavily to the founding of the Anti-Defamation League as a political maneuverer. Now, to get us into this topic, I think it's also good to look at a particular figure who operated for many, many years in many, many different countries as a spy for Israeli intelligence, but has then gone on to produce some of the biggest films in Hollywood. So, for instance, if one were to ask, what does the film Mr. and Mrs. Smith and 12 Years a Slave and Fight Club and Big Mama's House 2, LA Confidential and Pretty Woman, what do these films have in common? Well, they were all produced by a gentleman by the name of Arnon Milchan. Now, Arnon Milchan was recruited by Shimon Peres, who had this to say about him. He said, Arnon is a special man. It was I who recruited him. When I was at the Ministry of Defense, Arnon was involved in numerous defense-related procurement activities and intelligence operations. His strength is in making connections at the highest levels. His activities gave us a huge advantage, strategically, diplomatically, and technologically. Now, at the peak of his activities, Arnon Milchan claims that he was operating 30 different companies on behalf of Israeli intelligence in 17 different countries. Now, today he finds himself to be worth 2.6 billion pounds and a very well-known person in the upper echelons of Hollywood. Well, to lead us into this discussion, I would like to bring in first Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who publishes regularly on Mint Press and also is responsible for the important Palestine Chronicle. Now, Ramzy's article, which we will delve into, starts by looking at this character, Sabra, which is projected to be included in the new Marvel film, Captain America, New World Order. Ramzy, thank you for joining us. Could you tell us a bit about Sabra, please?
Thank you for having me, Lowkey, and it's great to be back on your program. I think this character, Sabra, although it's relatively old character, it comes back, it comes from 80s comic books. I think the timing of introducing Sabra is kind of really fits nicely to the progression of Israeli propaganda in Hollywood and in American movies and entertainment industry in general. We are living in an age now where a superhero can actually be a Mossad agent. Now, the Mossad, by everybody's admission, and I don't think the Mossad themselves would deny this, is a notorious organization that is responsible for the assassination of many people, sabotage, destruction, all sorts of sinister business. This is by no means the kind of agency or organization that should be introduced to American youth or youth anywhere in the world for that matter, as if they are the saviors of the human race, the people who are controlling the bad guys at any price, sort of thing. But the thing is, what is mind-boggling about this is that the timing of this, it's just that we pretend that we are living in an age of progressive thinking, of where we are holding the racist accountable on social media, in entertainment. We are very sensitive about the roles in which women or people of color or others are being cast in Hollywood, and we go to the very little details in order for us to ensure that this sort of archaic thinking is behind us. Yet, when it comes to Palestine, the Palestinians, Israel, Muslims and Arabs in general in Hollywood, it seems that things are, going even backward in terms of racism, stereotype, and that sort of thing. But it's a whole different business, of course, introducing Israeli assassins as if American superheroes. And this is why many, many people are either scratching their heads or very angry by this. But again, what I try to argue in my article, that this is not a random act, that there is a context and there is history of how Israel was introduced to American audiences and how the Palestinians were demonized and negatively portrayed to American audiences, that led us to this moment in which Marvel Studios think that it is okay to bring a Palestinian assassin or an Israeli assassin of Palestinians rather, and introduce him as a good role model for Americans.
And of course, the actress who is scheduled to play this Sabra character is Shira Haas, who herself has been supported by the Israel lobby group Stand With Us. She actually learnt to act as a part of the Israeli military theater. So there's quite a lot of interesting aspects to this story. Could you also tell us, Ramzy, about Gal Gadot and some of the controversy around that particular
Well, that's
film?
right. I mean, what is interesting about Gal Gadot is that she is a very political figure in Israel. She is pro-military, pro-government. She makes all these statements in support of various Israeli wars against Gaza. But when she was introduced by DC, which is the other major company of superheroes similar to Marvel Studios, she wasn't necessarily introduced. She was introduced as Wonder Woman, but there was no actual links to Israel. Now there is a difference. Of course, that is problematic as well, because what you are doing here, you are whitewashing war criminals. That's what you're doing. You're bringing former soldiers and you are making them superheroes, and they have to do numerous interviews, as we know how these things work, to promote your films. So you are normalizing Israel. You're normalizing Israeli apartheid. You're normalizing the Israeli military. And therefore, you are explaining and justifying and rationalizing violence against Palestinians. But Sabra is different than Gal Gadot. It's a lot worse in a sense, because the character herself, who is very much an Israeli and very much part of the Israeli government establishment, she is bringing that package with her. She is coming to Hollywood as an Israeli, and not any Israeli, not just an ordinary Israeli minding her own business, but rather as an Israeli Mossad agent who, and the history of the Mossad, many people are already aware of that history, and it's not really associated with a lot of positive things. But for Palestinians, many of us, know people, Palestinian intellectuals, Palestinian poets, Palestinian political activists, and Palestinian scientists who have been either kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by the Mossad. So this is, we are fully aware of what the Mossad is and what they represent for Palestinians. So not only this is a completely uncalled for move on behalf of Marvel Studios, but it holds no regards whatsoever towards Palestinians and the violent history imposed on them by Israel, led by the Mossad and by the Israeli army. So here you have Gal Gadot, someone who represents the Israeli army, and Sabra, who represent the Mossad intelligence services, coming together and again being portrayed as the saviors, as progressive figures who are there to inspire and to be followed and mimicked by Americans and by audiences around the world.
Another interesting aspect which you touch upon in your piece is the film Munich. Now, the director of Munich, Steven Spielberg, today is the head of a charity called the Righteous Persons Foundation. Now, the Righteous Persons Foundation not only funds the ADL, but it also funds the Jerusalem Foundation, which builds settlements in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. Could you tell us a little bit about Munich and its role in this whole process, please, Ramzy?
I think Munich was the kind of the beginning of Israel kind of taking responsibility of its violence against Palestinians, but in a different way, with a spin. And the timing in all of this, Lowkey, is particularly important. 2005 was the release of Munich. That was several years after the American so-called war on terror, the demonizing of Muslims, Arabs everywhere, the killing of millions of Muslims around the world as part of Bush's war. That was a perfect timing for the release of Munich, because prior to that, it's so important that we look back at history. And I'm going to go through very, very briefly through this, not to bore your audiences. But in the 50s and 60s, we had this romantic idea of Israel. Israel as a place in which, Jews from all over the world returning to their biblical, historic homeland. And that idea wasn't necessarily sold by the Israelis themselves. The Israelis were actually quite marginal in that. It was sold by those who sympathized with Israel and Hollywood, and there were so many. Until 1967, when things have changed. There was the David and Goliath metaphor here, and it was being used in abundance. That was the stage, post-1967, in which we start seeing Israelis, actual Israelis, soldiers, generals, military spokespeople coming to the United States, lecturing at American universities, even high schools, talking about the heroism, facing all of these Arab armies and feeling, the fact that Israel's existence was at stake and yet fighting and winning. So there was that heroic Israeli that became very present in American media and American society in general until 1982, the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which we just commemorated the 40th anniversary of that horrific massacre in Lebanon just a few days ago. That's when Israel was being associated with something else entirely. The death of 17 or the killing of 17,000 Lebanese, Palestinians, and Syrians in the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 made it very, very difficult for Israel to convey that image of the heroic Israel fighting against the hordes of Arabs and Muslims. So they needed to reinvent Israel, and that is what I call the golden age of Israel in sitcoms. That's when Israel became kind of a staple in sitcoms, but kind of almost in an indirect way. Friends, Frasier, that sort of things. You start mentioning the word Israel, sometimes in self-deprecation language, sometimes is just in humor. But the idea is to affiliate Israel with something positive, with something funny. Until 2001, when things have changed. That's when Netanyahu declared in American media that 9/11 was good for Israel, and then he corrected himself by saying, because Americans can now understand and relate to what we have to go through on a daily basis. And that's when Hollywood comes in. And that's when Munich, that's the exact context of Munich coming in with Spielberg's trying to show, taking ownership of Israeli violence by the Mossad in particular, but also presenting it as moral dilemma. We have to protect ourselves. We have to, at what point does security, at one point does violence become morally justifiable? And when is, what is the definition of one's national security? Does it stay in Israel itself, or does it go to Germany? So it kind of took us into this spin, making us think that Israel is actually making moral choices after all. But sometimes These moral choices are quite difficult for us to digest, but what can you do? The Americans are doing it in Iraq, in Afghanistan, all over the world, and we have to do what we have to do. That's essentially the very premise of the war on terror. But since then until now, that conversation has been advanced to something different, entirely different. Racism in the United States has grown exponentially, and the Israelis don't have to beat around the bushes anymore. Now they are superheroes. They are fighting crimes. They are fighting the evil of the world. And naturally, if you are an Israeli fighting evil, then naturally Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians have to be on the other side of that evil.
Absolutely. And I think the key thing to remember when thinking about Israeli intelligence, it's believed to be responsible for assassinations in up to 18 different countries in the world. Now, moving on just to the kind of infrastructure behind what produces a character like Sabra, we're going to bring in Jessica Buxbaum, whose piece about Marvel Studios and the relationship which seems to exist between key figures at Marvel Studios and Israeli intelligence. It seems to partly explain why and how a decision like this could have come about. Thank you very much for joining us, Jessica, writer and contributor to Mint Press. Jessica, what did you find at Marvel Studios?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on today. Good to be back on your show, Lowkey. A lot of previous investors of the early days at Marvel, and also the CEO and chairman of Marvel. So the chairman of Marvel, Isaac Perlmutter, I believe, is how you pronounce his name. So he grew up in 1948 occupied Palestine, and he served in the Israel-occupied forces during the Six-Day War in 1967. And also the CEO of Marvel Entertainment, Avi Arad, also same thing, grew up there and served in the Israeli army during the Six-Day War. And there's also a lot of connections about the foundations that these Marvel heads have and how they're donating to pro-Israel Zionist causes. Perlmutter has a foundation with his wife, and they support the ADL, Friends of the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, the Jewish Federation in Florida, the Jewish Agency for Israel. So there's ties there as well. And then previous Marvel Comics investors, both Ronald Perelman and then also Carl Ihan, they are, potentially maybe had donated to Benjamin Netanyahu before the 2007 election, so the former Prime Minister of Israel. And they also contribute to many pro-Israel organizations, such as the Jewish National Fund. And, the Jewish National Fund has been in the news a lot recently. There's a campaign called Stop the JNF campaign. And, the Jewish National Fund is very integral in trying to establish illegal Jewish colonies, settlements throughout Palestine, also planting, trees to try and displace Palestinians and Bedouins. So, there's all this different connection there. And then you also have Amy Pascal, who works for Sony, and she does a lot between Sony and Marvel, kind of doing a lot of collaboration there. She also, is supporting the Creative Community for Peace, an organization that's basically trying to stop the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement within Hollywood and trying to stamp out any kind of activism around BDS in the entertainment industry. She also, received emails from a now no longer organization called Israel Project, and she received emails from them about the security situation going on in Israel. And I mean, she also talked to the Jewish Federation in Los Angeles. She attended an event held with the Jewish Federation, held at the Jewish Federation in LA, and basically, talking again about the security situation in Israel. So, there's a lot of heavy Israel lobby influences, and a lot of these people are clearly donating and supporting these pro-Israel Zionist causes.
There also seems to be a particular Trump connection, especially when we look at Isaac Perlmutter and some of the initial investors in Marvel. What could you tell us about that Israel lobby connection, but then also the Trump connection to Marvel Studios?
So with Perlmutter, his wife and him, his wife Laura and him, had both donated, through both elections, and basically millions to Trump's campaign in both 2016 and then in 2020. They had supported things like the Trump Victory Committee, things like that, and then they supported a lot of money to these campaigns, and it ended up being that then, because they're supporting all of these political action committees in support of Trump, they ended up getting Perlmutter ended up becoming basically like it was quoted as like the shadow head of the Department of Veteran Affairs, where he was able to basically be like an advisor and shaping policies at the VA, even though he wasn't, like an official policymaker or politician or in that role. But he was basically chosen by Trump to get that kind of policymaking role. And then again, Ronald Perlman, who was the one of the early investors for Marvel Comics. So he also donated to Trump's Victory Committee, so another Trump PAC, back in 2017. He's also friends with Trump's son-in-law. There's a lot of campaign donations and friendly connections going on.
And of course, this implies a political position. And I think one of the things that has gone missing in the conversation about the inclusion of Sabra is that the Marvel film Captain America: First Avenger actually entailed Marvel working very closely with the US military. Marvel used the US base Camp Edward. You also have an example where the film was tasked with promoting US patriotism, and also gave what has been described as historically inaccurate portrayals of the US military, such as having non-segregated battalions, which of course is not the case. You also saw Marvel Studios work closely with the US military for the film Captain Marvel, also Iron Man 1 and 2, as Alan MacLeod has gone into quite deeply in his work before. Also Hulk, Captain Marvel, The Eternals, all of these films entailed Marvel Studios working closely with the US military. So of course it would make sense that somebody like Isaac Perlmutter, the CEO of Marvel Studios, would have that role as sort of a key role within this the Department for Veteran Affairs. You even saw Marvel director James Gunn actually lash out on Twitter, claiming that his films didn't get approved by the military. He said, when a film uses military assets for free, those specific scripts have to get military approval to make sure the military isn't disparaged. This is very few films, and from what I know, the military is pretty loose about it. So clearly, that's an admission that actually the US military has essentially co-produced Marvel films. This has major ramifications for freedom of speech. It has major ramifications for key US parts of the US Constitution, even when it comes to the favoritism which is practiced by the US military towards films which are complementary to the US military and against films which are not. So it's clear that there is a sort of incestuous relationship between these different key nodes of power. Now, if we can bring in Alan MacLeod next, who has launched a new series on Mint Press by the name of the Israel Files, which has entailed Mint Press investigators going through the WikiLeaks files in depth for more information about what it reveals about Israel and its role in the world, as well as its occupation of Palestine. Now, we open the scene really in 2014 when the Operation Protective Edge, as it was called by the Israeli military, saw over 2,000 Palestinians killed in the Gaza Strip. It was subject to intense Israeli bombing. Certainly in the last 10 years, it was the most intense campaign that we've seen. And you also saw in terms of in Gaza, and you saw a ground invasion, which included the horrific massacre at Shuja'iyya. Now, Alan, can you just set the scene for us? While that was happening, while white phosphorus was literally raining down on Palestinians, something was happening in the inboxes of some of Hollywood's most prominent producers and directors, and even superstars. Could you tell us about that, Alan?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for having me on the show again. I guess I could say as Israel was attacking Gaza, Hollywood was getting busy playing defense for Israel. And what I mean by that is a lot of the biggest and most influential producers in Hollywood were getting together, looking at what was happening and sending each other emails saying things like, this can never be allowed to happen again. And what they were talking about was not the Israeli bombing of a civilian population forcing more than 100,000 people to flee their homes. They were talking about the widespread outrage, even among the intellectual elite of the West, at these crimes. So, for instance, you had people like Penelope Cruz signing a letter calling Israel or implying Israel was a, quote, genocidal state. This really worried a lot of movers and shakers in Hollywood. And these WikiLeaks released files, the Sony Archive as it's called, really show that they came together to try to coordinate a plan to try to stamp out pro-Palestine or anything that could be seen as critical of Israel in the entertainment industry. And how they did that was by leveraging their power to try and silence people, to try to produce enough flack to make sure people would get the message. These people, some of the biggest producers, music, film, television, entertainment, started writing letters to people like the head of the Cannes Film Festival or the head of the New York Metropolitan Opera to try to get them to cancel productions or shut down screenings of films that they felt were pro-Palestine or anti-Israel. And to a certain extent, it actually worked. That sort of pressure did actually produce some results. These people are also completely obsessed with the British documentary filmmaker Ken Loach, who has for a long time been an activist on this issue and many others. the documents reveal that they actually decided to try to come up with, to try and produce a new documentary about a supposed new rise of anti-Semitism all across Europe, to specifically and explicitly, and I'll say it exactly, counter guys like Loach. That was their own words. This is what they were doing in secret behind closed doors. And they did try to recruit as many stars as possible. One star, very famously, who they did try to recruit was Natalie Portman, the Israeli-American actress. But she actually, in the emails, was very crude and blunt and said she was much more concerned that her personal email had got out to these people and she didn't want anything to do with them. However, one person they did recruit was Russell Simmons, the hip-hop music impresario who started the iconic Def Jam label in the 1980s, the brother of Rev Run Simmons from Run DMC. He's real hip-hop royalty. And what it came across is that Simmons was very interested in trying to promote the Israeli cause within the Black and Muslim communities in the United States, which he is integrated in, and that he was, getting workshops created, getting people organized to try to spread this message, all the while deflecting from the very obvious and salient fact that one side was bombing the other, but they were spreading a message of peace while playing defense for one of the most aggressive states in the world.
What we have here is the combination of an asymmetric military equation, asymmetrical power, but then we also have an asymmetrical equation when it comes to the cultural sphere, especially in the English language. So just for clarification, Alan, you have uncovered an attempt to blacklist Ken Loach from the Cannes Film Festival. Who was running this campaign to blacklist this much loved and significant cultural figure in England, Ken Loach? Who was running this campaign to blacklist him? And what exactly did that look like?
Well, it was a clique of producers. I think we could say it was led by the Hollywood producer Ron Rotholz, who was sending emails to the director of the Cannes Film Festival, trying to pressure them into kicking Loach out. He was talking about how there should be no place for people like Loach in the Cannes Film Festival. He was also part of a group that was trying to produce what is basically a propaganda documentary talking about a supposed rise in anti-Semitism across Europe, and that was specifically to counter Loach and his ideas, which were really gaining steam in the mid-2010s. Also, people involved in this were, we talked about her a little bit earlier on, Amy Pascal, who was the co-chairperson of Sony Pictures Entertainment at the same time. Mark Hansen, the producer of movies such as Get Carter, Immortals, and 300, also was involved in this. And other people were actually introducing Israeli officers from the IDF into the email chain, talking about, this is somebody we can work with, please talk to him, he knows a lot of this. And other things that came out was that other producers were actually meeting with people from the Israeli embassy. People like Ryan Kavanaugh, it came out that he was meeting people from the Israeli embassy and talking about these issues. So this sort of behind the scenes, closed door stuff, which you can kind of infer goes on whenever some star has to backtrack on whatever they say. And, you see these hysterical campaigns aimed against people like, say, Emma Watson for just daring to post an image with a Palestinian flag in it. You can kind of suggest that these things must be coordinated. And the great thing about these WikiLeaks emails, the Sony archive, is that it really proves that that is exactly what's going on.
Fantastic, Alan. And so the Israel files for Mint Press are going to be looking even more deeply at what WikiLeaks has revealed about these activities. Alan, on a personal level, could you say what you think WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have done for investigative journalism across the world. You are someone who has regularly brought to light brilliant investigations for people to really understand how power functions in the world through Mint Press. So what could you tell us about WikiLeaks and its contribution to investigative journalism?
Well, in the big picture, you could say that WikiLeaks and its documents have revealed that the emperor really does have no clothes. It's allowed us to pull back the curtain that's always veiled and see how the world really functions in all its gory details. For journalists, WikiLeaks has strengthened a lot of our work and given us a huge goldmine of things to go through. For other journalists, it's a threat because WikiLeaks is undermining them and showing them for the flatterers of the court that they really are. So ultimately, WikiLeaks has provided a huge resource for anybody who's interested in democracy or a just society, or just wants to know how the world functions. And so ultimately, we have to be, very thankful for that. And we also have to support the campaign to get Assange released for the supposed crime of producing information that the powerful elites don't want us to know.
Absolutely. And, the year that the war on terror began, you actually had 33 million classified actions carried out by the US government. And that year alone, it spent $5.5 billion on keeping those documents classified. And in fact, Peter Gallison, in the book Agnotology, The Making and Unmaking of Ignorance, actually estimates that the classified universe is probably much larger than the unclassified one. And so there you have this way in which ignorance as a political force is actively constructed in order to sort of coerce society into acquiescing to certain social arrangements. And it's really through the disguising of agency that happens. And you see it in the media world through a kind of culture of servility for access, which, the perfect example of that would be the D-Notice Committee, for example. Alan, could you tell us a bit about the D-Notice Committee and what you know of its function, really, in journalism?
Sorry, I didn't quite get that bit. Do you want to explain?
I was just talking about the D-Notice Committee. Essentially, this is a way in which civil servants from the British government are really able to prep journalists about what they are expecting to come up and how they would really like it to be covered. And often the way is that these journalists, especially in big organizations like BBC and otherwise, they perceive their role to be about preserving access to these passages of power. And so often what will happen is that a journalist will, rather than ask those difficult questions when they have been briefed by the D-Notice Committee, they will then see to it that they essentially reproduce press releases which are given to them by the Ministry of Defense in order really to avoid those difficult questions. And across these years of the war on terror, of which Hollywood has been a very key component in obtaining a kind of cultural ambience which can allow these things to happen. We've literally seen on average about 46 bombs per day being dropped for 20 years in wars that have displaced 37 million people. But if we were to look on the media and in Hollywood, it's very unlikely that we would see those type of realities reflected in an accurate and major way. And so that is what so much of the work at Mint Press is about. And the Israel Files, as part of a new series, is going to be uncovering some of those entanglements and other relationships. if we do have Ramzy still with us, though I understand he may have had to leave, I did want to inquire with either Ramzy or Jessica what they feel. We still have Ramzy with us. Fantastic. What do you feel these mechanisms that seem to exist within Hollywood kind of make clear to the public? Because on one hand, what we have is we have a lot of energy within Britain and in the United States around Palestinian rights, but we see so little of that vital energy reflected in our culture. And one of the ways that that's kept out of, for instance, musical expression within the English language is through an organization called Creative Community for Peace, which Jessica alluded to earlier, which is very active in the film industry, but it's actually more active in the music industry. They directly coordinate with the Israeli consulate in California, in Los Angeles, sorry, and you see some of the very top figures within the music industry on the Creative Community for Peace board and working with it closely. So how is it that we can go about kind of closing this gap between what is a vital energy which exists in the streets? Every time you see Gaza under fire, you have hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of London, full of energy and full of passion for the Palestinian cause, but very little of that is reflected within culture. How can we go about closing that gap, Dr. Ramzy?
Yes, this is a very, very important question, because I think we have kind of two types of work styles, two kind of paradigms at work here. One is the Israeli, and that they don't really work so much through popular mechanisms, because they know they don't have the numbers and they don't have the critical mass, and I don't think they will ever do, by the way. So what they do, and this is what Jessica and Alan have shown, is that there's this very intricate process, names, companies, networks, people working with other people. This is not random. None of this is random. So this whole idea, let's call on Hollywood to be nice. You know, maybe Hollywood needs to stop being racist. That is convenient, but it doesn't work that way. Hollywood is structured around racism, whether against Black people or Arab people or people in the global South who are disadvantaged and, marginalized communities in their own societies. Hollywood is part and parcel of the establishment. And that is not going to change until Hollywood is entirely erased and recreated at one point in the future. The Palestinian side of this is that we have numbers on our side, but we don't have the mechanisms, and we don't have the structures, and we don't have the organizations, more or less. We have successes here and there. We have a hashtag that goes viral. We have a letter that is signed by some celebrities, and we get excited about this for a while, but it's not sustainable. I am not a big fan of working through mainstream anything. If experience has taught us anything, is that you have to create your own channels. They work from the top-bottom approach. We work grassroots. We reach out to ordinary people. We invest in solidarity, intersectionality, and I'm not using that as this kind of political cliche. I'm talking about working in every facet of society, whether through entertainment, music, popular mobilization, charity work, academia, and so forth and so on. Building bridges, working from the bottom up, and trying to reverse this dynamic that has been inclined in favor of Israel for so many years. And I think, Mint Press is obviously an excellent example of how, operating from the outside can actually have its own sustainable degree of success. Maybe, this whole idea that we have to get, as many views as New York Times or CNN in order for us to be effective. I don't believe in that. I think low grade but sustainable influence over the course of years will eventually create a paradigm shift. And I think you, Lowkey, yourself have been an excellent example of that. I mean, we've all known how, the kind of influence you played within the music industry and the many successes you've had in this field. So I think we have a lot to work with here. The question is, it has to be developed separately through our own channels, and our success story will happen when we can actually convert numbers into a sustainable mechanism and actual structures.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramzy. That's very kind of you to say. And I think the interesting thing is where all of these, we're looking at culture, we're looking at journalism, but when we look at the forces which are combined against us, we see quite interesting overlaps. So, for example, the organization which has worked to try and take me off of Spotify, We Believe in Israel, is led by a gentleman by the name of Luke Akehurst. Now, Luke Akehurst is on the Labour Party's National Executive Committee. This is somebody who is a political consultant for the Ministry of Defense on arms deals. This is in his words, not mine. And this organization, We Believe in Israel, according to the Al Jazeera lobby documentary, Shai Massoud, the now expelled Israeli spy in this country, said that We Believe in Israel shares its office with BICOM. We know that We Believe in Israel is a project of BICOM. Shai Massoud spoke in glowing terms about Luke Akehurst, but the function of BICOM has been mainly focused on lobbying the media. And it's actually the largest Israel lobby group in this country, but it's one that actually the least is known about, because a lot of the other smaller ones were more prominent in the campaign against Corbyn, whereas BICOM, it focuses its energy on lobbying specifically the BBC, but a lot of the time journalists. It organizes trips for journalists to visit occupied Palestine, where they are treated to 5-star treatment, and then to go back and really protect the Israeli cause, really, in the public sphere. But then the interesting thing is, when you look at the amount of money pumped into BICOM, you look at the bipartisan relationship with it, you've got key figures from the Conservative Party there, you've also got key figures from the Labour Party there. And something else which I've noticed recently in the Labour files, which I think is worthy of mention, Halima Khan, who was a key whistleblower in the Labour files, these were the documents which have exposed that the Labour Party, in some cases, was quite cynical in its organizing of the expelling and the real life cancelling of key Corbyn supporters. We also see evidence that the Muslim community in Newham were targeted by this sort of internal surveillance system. But an interesting aspect, which I think has not been emphasized much, is that Halima Khan at one point says that when the Jewish Chronicle would provide the Labour Investigations Unit with names of people that it was hoping would be suspended or expelled, often the Labour office would stay behind late into the night working on those particular cases. Now, the key point here is that Emily Matlis from Newsnight just a few weeks ago stated that there was an agent of the Conservative Party at the heart of the BBC. Who was that agent at the heart of the BBC? It was a gentleman by the name of Robbie Gibb. Who is Robbie Gibb? Robbie Gibb is the sole director of the Jewish Chronicle. So what we're now saying is that an organization who seemingly was dictating who Labour did and didn't suspend and expel is led by someone that Emily Maitlis describes as a conservative agent. So it's interesting this way that the Israel lobby in the United States and in Britain has been able to integrate itself completely with the establishments of both countries and use the establishment power, which is expressed through the blacklisting of people, to really harness these organizations and these institutions as weapons in both a cultural and political and even economic sense against not only dissidents, not only key critics. Essentially, we don't live in a democratic system, and that is not a surprise to many of us, but to much of society, it's been one of the key mantras which they've repeated again and again and again. We supposedly live in a society where you can change the people that govern the society through voting. But what is revealed both by these investigations and these important pieces and also the Labour files on Al Jazeera is that actually it's a very carefully curated sphere that we are in. Now, Alan, I don't want to jump the gun, but we have been looking a little bit at the BBC, and obviously with the Queen's death, there has been the kind of exposure of the BBC in a way that it hasn't been exposed before as very much a tool of the British establishment. What could you tell us about what you've been looking at with the BBC so far?
I think that's a really good way to describe it, a tool that the establishment uses to maintain power. The BBC likes to present itself as a neutral body, but in fact, even from its very beginnings in the 1920s, it has been fundamentally linked with state power. Its big break was in 1926 when it joined with the government to defeat the general strike. The Controller General of the BBC, Lord Reith, said that he was so thankful that the general strike had been broken, and he said that if France had a BBC in 1789, there would not have been any French Revolution. And what we found going up to the present day is that we have multiple agents from the British military, from NATO, even from groups associated with the Israeli government, groups associated with the Conservative Party, people who are former Conservative Party members who even stood for election as Conservatives, having key roles in the BBC. And it's well known, or at least it should be well known, that for many decades, the BBC employed a strict policy where every single person for any kind of important position, any kind of, even things like lighting might even put somebody up for this, but they were vetted by MI5, which is the UK's secret service, basically. And when the BBC actually asked MI5 whether this policy was still live, they asked them only a couple of years ago. MI5 refused to comment. So quite clearly, this is still going on to this day, that they are vetting people to make sure that their opinions are not too radical. And if they are not going to get on the BBC. And so ultimately what we found is the BBC continues to be a state broadcaster, even though it is not talked about it in that kind of tone. But not only that, we've got positions where people who've been working for NATO in fields such as psychological operations have simultaneously been working for the BBC in the programming department and other departments, which really raises the specter of just how controlled is this and just how carefully thought out is the propaganda that all British people are receiving pretty much every day.
Thank you so much for that, Alan. And as all four of us are doing what we can to expose and make explicit the implicit unfreedoms of our societies, thank you to Jessica, to Ramzy, and to Alan for joining me today on a special episode of The Watchdog. Thank you to all of those tuning in. I hope that you can continue to support what we do. Thank you very much.